The modern understanding of the Viking Age is fundamentally a product of archaeology. While medieval chronicles, annals, and sagas provide indispensable narrative frameworks, it is archaeological research that has transformed the Vikings from caricatured raiders into historically grounded societies with complex economies, belief systems, and technological sophistication. The historiography of Viking archaeology itself mirrors broader developments in European archaeology, moving from antiquarian collection and nationalist mythmaking toward interdisciplinary, scientifically grounded investigation. The Vikings, perhaps more than any other early medieval culture, illustrate how material evidence can challenge, refine, and sometimes overturn textual traditions. Early archaeological interest in the Vikings emerged in the 17th and 18th centuries, particularly in Scandinavia, where antiquarians began to document burial mounds, rune stones, and monumental ship graves. These early scholars operated within a framework that sought to glorify national pasts. In Sweden and Denmark especially, Viking remains were interpreted as evidence of ancestral greatness, often stripped of social nuance and embedded in romanticized narratives of heroic warrior ancestors. This phase of research produced valuable documentation but lacked methodological rigor and frequently ignored stratigraphy, context, and comparative analysis. The 19th century marked a decisive turning point. The professionalization of archaeology, particularly through the development of typology and stratigraphic excavation, allowed Viking material culture to be studied systematically. Scandinavian scholars such as Jens Jacob Asmussen Wersey pioneered methods that linked artifacts to chronological sequences rather than legendary accounts. Wersey's insistence that archaeological interpretation must be grounded in material context rather than saga literature laid the foundation for modern Viking archaeology. During this period, grave goods, weapon types, jewelry styles, and settlement remains were catalogued and compared across regions, revealing both shared cultural patterns and significant local variation. One of the most transformative discoveries in Viking archaeology came with the excavation of ship burials. The Osberg ship, unearthed in Norway in 1904, fundamentally altered scholarly perceptions of Viking society. Far from being merely a warship, the Osberg vessel was a richly decorated ceremonial ship used as a burial for elite individuals, likely women of exceptionally high status. The extraordinary preservation of wood carvings, textiles, wagons, and everyday objects provided an unprecedented window into Viking craftsmanship, aesthetics, ritual practices, and gender dynamics. The ship demonstrated that Viking art was not crude or utilitarian but sophisticated, symbolic, and deeply embedded in social meaning. Shortly thereafter, the discovery of the Gokstad ship reinforced the understanding of Viking maritime capabilities. Unlike Osberg, Gokstad was clearly a seaworthy vessel designed for long-distance travel, capable of crossing the North Sea and navigating both open waters and shallow rivers. Experimental archaeology, including full-scale reconstructions and voyages, confirmed that Viking ships were among the most advanced maritime technologies of the early medieval world. These findings shifted scholarly focus toward the centrality of shipbuilding, navigation, and logistical organization in Viking expansion. Settlement archaeology further complicated earlier narratives. Excavations at sites such as Birka in Sweden, Hedeby in modern Germany, and Kaupang in Norway revealed dense, structured urban environments engaged in long-distance trade. These were not transient pirate camps but permanent settlements with workshops, marketplaces, storage facilities, and social hierarchies. The presence of foreign goods, including Islamic silver, Byzantine silk, and Frankish glassware, provided material confirmation of the Vikings' integration into global trade networks. Such discoveries undermined the notion of Vikings as isolated northern barbarians and instead positioned them as key intermediaries in early medieval economic systems. Equally important has been the archaeology of rural life. Farmsteads, field systems, animal remains, and botanical evidence have allowed researchers to reconstruct Viking subsistence strategies in remarkable detail. These studies demonstrate that the overwhelming majority of Vikings were not warriors but farmers, herders, fishers, and craftspeople. The seasonal rhythm of agricultural labor structured social life, while raiding and trading expeditions represented episodic, though culturally significant, extensions of this agrarian base. This realization has profoundly reshaped scholarly interpretations of Viking society, emphasizing continuity and stability rather than perpetual violence. Burial archaeology has played a central role in understanding Viking beliefs, social stratification, and identity. Graves vary enormously in wealth, form, and ritual practice, ranging from simple inhumations to elaborate ship burials accompanied by weapons, animals, and symbolic objects. Such variation reflects not only economic inequality but also regional traditions and shifting religious beliefs. The gradual appearance of Christian burial practices alongside pagan ones illustrates the complex and non-linear process of Christianization in Scandinavia. Rather than a sudden conversion, archaeology reveals centuries of religious coexistence, negotiation, and adaptation. Bioarchaeology and osteological analysis have further enriched the picture. Skeletal remains provide evidence of diet, health, trauma, and life expectancy. Contrary to popular images of uniformly violent lives, many Viking individuals show signs of long-term labor stress rather than combat injury, reinforcing the interpretation of a predominantly agrarian society. Isotopic analysis has revealed patterns of mobility, showing that some individuals buried in Scandinavia were born elsewhere and vice versa. This confirms that Viking society was demographically dynamic and socially permeable. In recent decades, the integration of scientific techniques has revolutionized Viking archaeology. DNA analysis has demonstrated that Viking communities were genetically diverse, incorporating individuals of Baltic, Slavic, Celtic, and even Southern European origin. These findings decisively refute earlier racialized interpretations of Viking identity and instead support a model of cultural affiliation defined by language, practice, and social participation rather than ancestry alone. Environmental archaeology, including pollen analysis and climate reconstruction, has contextualized Viking expansion within broader ecological pressures and opportunities, such as climatic fluctuations during the medieval warm period. Parallel to archaeological research, museums have played a crucial role in shaping both scholarly discourse and public understanding of the Vikings. Viking museums are not merely repositories of artifacts but active participants in knowledge production, interpretation, and cultural memory. Institutions such as the Viking Ship Museum in Oslo, the National Museum of Denmark in Copenhagen, and the Swedish History Museum in Stockholm serve as central hubs for research, conservation, and exhibition. These museums house some of the most important Viking artifacts in the world, including ship remains, hoards, weapons, textiles, and ritual objects. The museological presentation of the Vikings has evolved significantly over time. Early exhibitions often emphasized martial aspects, reinforcing stereotypes of violence and conquest. Contemporary museum practice, by contrast, seeks to contextualize artifacts within broader social, economic, and cultural frameworks. Interactive displays, reconstructed environments, and multimedia installations aim to convey the complexity of Viking life, including domestic activities, trade, belief systems, and artistic expression. This shift reflects broader changes in historical interpretation and public engagement. Open-air museums and reconstructed sites have become particularly influential. Places such as Lofoter in Norway and Ribe in Denmark offer experimental engagement with Viking architecture, crafts, and daily life. While such reconstructions inevitably involve interpretive choices, they are grounded in archaeological evidence and experimental research. For scholars, these sites function as laboratories for testing hypotheses about building techniques, tool use, and social organization. For the public, they provide an embodied understanding of Viking life that textual descriptions alone cannot convey. Internationally, Viking archaeology has fostered extensive collaboration. Excavations in the British Isles, Ireland, France, Russia, and the Baltic states demonstrate that Viking history cannot be confined to Scandinavia. Museums in York, Dublin, and Normandy present the Viking past as a shared European heritage shaped by migration, conflict, and cultural exchange. This transnational perspective has become increasingly important in countering nationalist appropriations of Viking imagery and emphasizing historical interconnectedness. Ethical considerations now occupy a central place in Viking archaeology and museology. Issues surrounding the excavation of human remains, the ownership of artifacts, and the representation of violence and slavery are actively debated. Museums increasingly address uncomfortable aspects of Viking history, including enslavement, gender inequality, and environmental impact, rather than perpetuating sanitized or heroic narratives. This reflects a broader commitment to critical, inclusive history. In sum, Archaeological research and museum practice have transformed the Vikings from figures of myth into historically grounded societies whose complexity rivals that of any early medieval culture. The Viking Age, as revealed through material evidence, was not an aberration but an integral part of the formation of medieval Europe and Eurasia. Archaeology has shown that Viking identity was fluid, adaptive, and deeply entangled with the wider world. Museums, in turn, serve as the public interface of this scholarship, translating decades of research into narratives that challenge stereotypes and invite reflection. Together, archaeology and museology ensure that the Viking past is not merely remembered, but critically understood. The term Viking is one of the most frequently used yet conceptually problematic notions in medieval historiography. In popular discourse, Vikings are often portrayed as a homogeneous race of violent warriors. However, contemporary academic scholarship has long abandoned this interpretation. The word Viking does not denote an ethnic group or a biologically defined race, but rather refers to a specific set of activities, primarily overseas expeditions involving raiding, trading, exploration, and settlement, undertaken by Scandinavian societies between approximately the mid-8th and early 11th centuries. To understand the Viking phenomenon properly, it is therefore necessary to move beyond simplistic stereotypes and analyze it as a complex socio-economic and cultural process rooted in the historical conditions of early medieval Northern Europe. From a linguistic and cultural standpoint, the peoples commonly labeled as Vikings belonged to the North Germanic branch of the Indo-European language family. They originated in the regions that today correspond to Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. Their shared language, Old Norse, functioned as a unifying medium across much of Scandinavia and its overseas settlements. Over time, regional variations emerged, but mutual intelligibility remained high during the Viking Age. The linguistic evidence, preserved in runic inscriptions and later literary sources, demonstrates strong continuity with earlier Germanic traditions while also reflecting the unique cultural developments of the Scandinavian world. It is important to emphasize that the concept of race, as understood in modern biological terms, is not applicable to Viking societies. Archaeological and genetic research conducted in recent decades has revealed a considerable degree of diversity within Viking populations. Individuals of Baltic, Finno-Ugric, Slavic, and British origin were integrated into Viking communities through trade, migration, intermarriage, and slavery. Viking identity was therefore cultural and social rather than biological. One could become a Viking through participation in certain activities and networks, regardless of ancestral origin. The environmental conditions of Scandinavia played a crucial role in shaping Viking society. Much of the region is characterized by mountainous terrain, dense forests, limited arable land, and a relatively harsh climate with short growing seasons. These constraints placed pressure on agricultural production and contributed to demographic stress, particularly among free farming populations. Rather than viewing Viking expansion as the result of innate aggression, it is more accurate to understand it as a rational response to ecological and economic challenges combined with technological innovation, especially in shipbuilding and navigation. The sea, for the Vikings, was not a barrier but a connective space. Scandinavian ship technology, most notably the development of longships and cargo vessels, enabled rapid movement across open seas and shallow rivers alike. Viking ships combined speed, flexibility, and durability, allowing their crews to travel vast distances with remarkable efficiency. Through river systems such as the Volga and the Dnieper, Viking groups, particularly those known in Eastern Europe as Varangians, established trade routes linking the Baltic Sea to the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic world. Viking society was structured around a hierarchical yet relatively flexible social order. At the top were the Jarls, local elites who controlled land, wealth, and military resources. Below them were the Corals, free men who formed the backbone of society. Corals were typically farmers, craftsmen, traders, and sailors. They possessed legal rights and could participate in local assemblies. At the bottom of the social hierarchy were the thralls, or slaves, who were acquired through warfare, raiding, debt, or trade. Slavery was an integral component of the Viking economy and social system, although it has often been underrepresented in earlier historiography. Political organization in the Viking world was predominantly decentralized. Rather than centralized states, power was distributed among local leaders and assemblies known as things. These assemblies served judicial, legislative, and political functions. Disputes were resolved through legal procedures that emphasized compensation rather than corporal punishment, thereby limiting cycles of blood feud. The Thing system represents a significant example of early participatory governance and legal rationality in medieval Europe. Economically, Viking societies were far more diverse than the traditional image of raiders suggests. While raiding played an important role, especially during the early phases of Viking expansion, it constituted only one element of a broader economic system. Agriculture and animal husbandry remained the primary means of subsistence for most of the population. Fishing, hunting, and gathering supplemented food supplies, particularly in coastal and northern regions. Craft production, including metalwork, textile manufacturing, and woodworking, was widespread and often of high quality. Trade was a defining feature of the Viking world. Scandinavian merchants were deeply integrated into long-distance trade networks that connected northern Europe with the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and Central Asia. Archaeological finds of Islamic silver coins, dirhams, in Scandinavia provide clear evidence of economic interaction with the Abbasid Caliphate. These trade networks facilitated not only the exchange of goods, such as furs, amber, slaves, weapons, and luxury items, but also the transmission of ideas, technologies, and cultural practices. Religion and worldview played a central role in shaping Viking culture. Pre-Christian Scandinavian religion was polytheistic and deeply embedded in social and political life. Deities such as Odin, Thor, and Frey were associated with warfare, order, fertility, and prosperity. Mythology emphasized themes of fate, honor, and cyclical time, most famously expressed in narratives surrounding Ragnarok, the eventual destruction and renewal of the cosmos. Religious practice was not centralized. Instead, it was closely tied to households, local communities, and chieftains. Viking attitudes toward death and the afterlife were complex and varied. While popular imagination often focuses on Valhalla as the universal destination of Viking warriors, archaeological evidence suggests a wide range of beliefs and burial practices. Ship burials, cremations, and inhumations reflect differences in status, region, and personal identity. These practices underscore the diversity of Viking society and challenge overly uniform interpretations of their beliefs. Chronologically, the Viking Age is often said to begin in 793 CE with the raid on the monastery of Lindisfarne in Northumbria. This event, recorded with horror by contemporary Christian chroniclers, symbolized the vulnerability of established religious and political institutions to external attack. During the 9th century, Viking activity expanded rapidly, encompassing raids, seasonal settlements, and eventually permanent colonization. A significant turning point occurred in 865 with the arrival of the so-called Great Heathen Army in England. Unlike earlier raiding parties, this force sought long-term control of territory, leading to profound political and demographic changes. Large parts of England came under Scandinavian influence, resulting in cultural and legal hybridity, particularly in the region known as the Danelaw. The colonization of Iceland between approximately 870 and 930 represents another major milestone. Iceland developed into a unique society characterized by the absence of a king and the presence of a sophisticated legal and literary culture. The establishment of the Althing, one of the world's oldest parliamentary institutions, illustrates the adaptability of Viking legal traditions in new environments. In Eastern Europe, Viking groups known as Varangians played a crucial role in the formation of early Rus polities, including Novgorod and Kiev. These developments laid the foundations for later Russian statehood. At the same time, Scandinavian warriors served as elite mercenaries in the Byzantine Empire, forming the famous Varangian Guard. The early 10th century also witnessed the transformation of Viking leaders into feudal rulers, most notably in Normandy, where the Viking chieftain Rollo received land from the Frankish king in 911. This process exemplifies how Viking groups transitioned from external raiders to integrated political actors within European power structures. By the late 10th and early 11th centuries, the gradual Christianization of Scandinavia and the consolidation of royal authority fundamentally altered Viking society. Pagan religious practices declined, centralized monarchies emerged, and overseas raiding diminished. The year 1066, marked by the Norman conquest of England, is traditionally regarded as the end of the Viking Age. However, this date signifies not disappearance but transformation. The descendants of Vikings had become kings, nobles, and subjects within the medieval European world. In conclusion, the Vikings should not be understood as merely barbaric raiders nor romanticized heroes. They were complex historical actors who contributed significantly to the economic integration, cultural exchange, and political transformation of medieval Europe. Their legacy lies not only in conquest and exploration but also in law, trade, state formation, and cross-cultural interaction. The end of the Viking Age represents a transition from mobility to settlement, from fragmentation to statehood, and from paganism to Christianity, a transformation that reshaped Northern Europe and left a lasting imprint on world history. The history of the Vikings cannot be fully understood if it is confined to the geographical boundaries of Scandinavia. From their very emergence, Viking societies were shaped as much by their interactions with neighboring states and cultures as by their internal social structures. The Viking world was not an isolated periphery of medieval Europe, but rather one of its most dynamic contact zones, where political conflict, trade, migration, and cultural exchange intersected continuously. In Western Europe, the most sustained and transformative interactions occurred between Viking groups and the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of England. Initial encounters in the late 8th century, symbolized by the raid on Lindisfarne, were episodic and predatory in nature. Over time, however, these encounters evolved into prolonged military campaigns, settlement, and political integration. The arrival of the so-called Great Heathen Army in the mid-9th century marked a decisive shift from seasonal raiding to organized conquest and territorial control. Viking rule over large parts of northern and eastern England resulted in the establishment of the Danelaw, a region where Scandinavian legal customs, linguistic features, and social practices were deeply embedded in local society. Archaeological evidence, place names, and linguistic survivals in Old English demonstrate that this interaction produced not mere domination, but a hybrid cultural landscape in which Norse and Anglo-Saxon traditions merged. Relations with the Frankish world followed a similar pattern of oscillation between violence and accommodation. Viking fleets navigated deep into the Carolingian heartlands via river systems such as the Seine and the Loire, exposing the structural weaknesses of early medieval states. Frankish rulers initially attempted to respond through military resistance and tribute payments, but the long-term solution proved to be political integration. The grant of Normandy to the Viking leader Rollo in 911 represents a critical turning point in Viking history. This agreement transformed Viking war leaders into landed Christian aristocrats and illustrates the remarkable adaptability of Viking elites. Within a few generations, the Normans had become fully integrated into the feudal order of Western Europe, eventually playing a decisive role in the politics of England and the Mediterranean world. In Eastern Europe, Scandinavian interaction took a different form. Swedish-based Viking groups, often referred to as Varangians, moved along the river systems connecting the Baltic Sea with the Black and Caspian Seas. In this region, their activities were less focused on raiding monasteries and more centered on trade, military service, and political leadership. Through sustained contact with Slavic and Finno-Ugric populations, Viking elites contributed to the formation of early Rus polities, including Novgorod and Kiev. Over time, these Scandinavian rulers assimilated linguistically and culturally, but their organizational and military practices left a lasting imprint on the political structures of Eastern Europe. The Byzantine Empire occupied a special place in the Viking imagination. Known in Old Norse sources as Miklagard, Constantinople represented wealth, power, and cosmopolitan sophistication. Viking involvement with Byzantium was characterized by both commerce and military service. The Varangian Guard, an elite unit composed largely of Scandinavian warriors, served as the personal bodyguard of the Byzantine emperor. This role reflects not only the martial reputation of Viking fighters but also their capacity to operate within highly complex and bureaucratic imperial systems while maintaining a distinct group identity. Viking engagement with the Islamic world further demonstrates the breadth of their external connections. Archaeological discoveries of Abbasid silver dirhams throughout Scandinavia provide tangible evidence of sustained trade relations extending deep into the Islamic economic sphere. These connections underscore the fact that Viking expansion was not simply a series of violent encounters but part of a wider Eurasian exchange network linking Northern Europe to the Mediterranean and beyond. These external relationships had profound demographic consequences. Scandinavia's limited agricultural capacity and harsh environmental conditions created persistent population pressures. Overseas migration and colonization functioned as safety valves, redistributing population surpluses to newly settled regions such as Iceland, the Faroe Islands, and Greenland. Importantly, these movements were not composed solely of male warriors but often involved entire households, indicating a deliberate and socially organized form of expansion. Such demographic flexibility allowed Viking societies to adapt to environmental constraints without internal collapse. At the core of Viking social organization stood the family and kinship network. The household was the fundamental economic, legal, and emotional unit of society. Kinship determined an individual's social identity, access to resources, and protection under the law. Feuds, alliances, and political loyalties were all mediated through extended family networks, making personal relationships central to social stability. Marriage served not only as a personal union but as a strategic instrument for consolidating wealth and forging alliances between families. Within this structure, Viking women occupied a position of relative legal and economic agency compared to many contemporaneous European societies. Women could own property, initiate divorce, and manage estates, particularly in the absence of male relatives engaged in overseas activities. Archaeological and textual evidence suggests that women played a crucial role in maintaining household continuity and social order, especially during periods of male absence. Childhood, likewise, was shaped by early socialization into gendered roles, with practical skills and cultural values transmitted through participation in daily labor and ritual life. Underlying these social arrangements was a distinctive socio-psychological framework centered on honor, reputation, and fate. Viking society operated largely as an honor culture, in which personal worth was measured by public recognition and the ability to defend one's reputation. Shame and loss of honor were perceived as existential threats, often prompting cycles of violence that legal mechanisms sought to contain rather than eliminate. Violence, therefore, was not an aberration but an integrated component of social regulation. The Viking conception of fate further reinforced this mindset. The belief that one's destiny was predetermined reduced fear of death and legitimized risk-taking behavior. Courage in the face of uncertainty was not merely admired but morally expected. This psychological orientation helps explain both the extraordinary mobility of Viking populations and their willingness to confront unfamiliar environments and powerful adversaries. In sum, the Viking world emerges not as a marginal or chaotic phenomenon but as a highly adaptive social system embedded in a network of regional and intercontinental relationships. Their interactions with neighboring states reshaped political boundaries, facilitated cultural exchange, and contributed to the formation of new societies. Demographic strategies, family structures, and socio-psychological values provided the internal cohesion necessary to sustain this expansive and transformative historical process. Viking history, viewed through this lens, is not a footnote to European history but one of its constitutive chapters. The historiography of the Vikings has long oscillated between two extremes. On the one hand, depictions of brutal marauders who burned monasteries and terrorized coastlines. On the other, romanticized images of fearless adventurers embodying ideals of freedom and heroism. Modern academic history rejects both simplifications. To understand the Vikings properly, one must analyze them not only through their internal social dynamics but also through the dense and multi-layered networks of interaction they established with neighboring polities. The Viking world was not an isolated cultural enclave but one of the most dynamic zones of contact in early medieval Eurasia. The relationships between Viking groups and the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of England constitute the most extensively documented and sustained set of interactions in Viking history. The raid on Lindisfarne at the end of the 8th century, often treated as a symbolic beginning, initially represented short-term predatory activity. By the mid-9th century, however, this relationship had transformed in nature. The arrival of the so-called Great Heathen Army in 865 demonstrated a level of military organization and strategic intent that went far beyond sporadic raiding. Northumbria and East Anglia fell under Scandinavian control, Mercia was weakened, and only Wessex managed to mount long-term resistance. The emergence of the Danelaw marked a profound structural change as Scandinavian legal customs, place names, measurement systems, and everyday practices became embedded within the social fabric of England. Linguistic evidence reveals that hundreds of Old Norse terms entered the English language, indicating deep cultural integration rather than mere occupation. Relations with the Frankish world followed a similarly complex trajectory, fluctuating between violence and negotiation. Viking fleets exploited the river systems of the Seine, Loire, and Garonne as natural corridors, reaching deep into the heart of Carolingian territory and threatening major urban centers such as Paris and Orleans. Carolingian rulers initially relied on tribute payments and defensive fortifications, but these measures proved insufficient. The grant of Normandy to the Viking leader Rollo in 911 represents a pragmatic diplomatic solution and marks a turning point in Viking history. From this moment, Scandinavian war leaders began their transformation into landed feudal aristocrats. The Normans rapidly adopted Christianity, the French language, and feudal institutions, eventually becoming one of the most influential political forces in medieval Europe. This process illustrates the remarkable adaptive capacity of Viking elites. Eastern Europe constituted a different but equally significant sphere of interaction. Scandinavian groups, predominantly of Swedish origin and commonly referred to as Varangians, navigated the river networks connecting the Baltic to the Black and Caspian Seas. In doing so, they came into sustained contact with Slavic, Finnic, and Baltic populations. These Varangian elites played a crucial role in the emergence of early political centers such as Novgorod and Kiev. The formation of early Rus polities was not the result of unilateral Scandinavian domination, but rather of a gradual synthesis between Norse leadership structures and Slavic demographic majorities. The Byzantine Empire occupied a unique place in the Viking imagination as a symbol of immense wealth, imperial order, and cosmopolitan splendor. Known in the sagas as Miklagard, Constantinople attracted Scandinavian traders and warriors alike. Viking involvement in the Varangian Guard, the emperor's elite personal bodyguard, demonstrates the high regard in which their military discipline and loyalty were held. At the same time, service in Byzantium exposed Viking individuals to advanced administrative systems, monumental architecture, and Christian ideology, experiences that would later influence developments in Scandinavia itself. Beyond the Christian world, Viking economic horizons extended into the Islamic sphere. Archaeological discoveries of large quantities of Abbasid silver dirhams across Scandinavia provide unequivocal evidence of sustained commercial exchange. These connections reveal that Viking economic activity operated on an Afro-Eurasian scale, integrating northern Europe into long-distance trade networks that reached the Middle East and Central Asia. Demographically, Viking society was shaped by the environmental constraints of Scandinavia. Limited arable land and short growing seasons imposed structural limits on population growth. As communities expanded, migration and colonization emerged as adaptive strategies. The settlement of Iceland, the Faroe Islands, and Greenland was not the product of isolated adventurers but of organized group migrations involving families and entire households. These movements reflect a high degree of social planning and communal decision-making. At the core of Viking society stood the family and the kinship group, which functioned as the fundamental units of economic production, legal responsibility, and social identity. An individual's status, security, and honor were inseparable from their lineage. Women in Viking society occupied a position that, while far from egalitarian by modern standards, afforded them greater legal and economic autonomy than that enjoyed by many of their contemporaries in Christian Europe. They could own property, initiate divorce, and exercise authority within the household, particularly in the absence of male relatives. Childhood in Viking society was not a protected or prolonged phase. From an early age, children were socialized into clearly defined gender roles and practical skills. Boys were prepared for agriculture, warfare, and seafaring, while girls were trained in household management, textile production, and food preparation. This early integration into adult responsibilities ensured the continuity of social norms and economic practices. The socio-psychological landscape of Viking society was structured around concepts of honor, reputation, and fate. Honor functioned as a form of social capital, and its loss could be as devastating as physical death. Violence, while omnipresent, was not inherently chaotic. Rather, it was embedded within a normative framework regulated by customary law. Legal mechanisms such as compensation payments sought to contain cycles of revenge and preserve social cohesion. Belief in fate played a crucial role in shaping Viking behavior. The conviction that one's destiny was predetermined reduced fear of death and legitimized risk-taking, whether in battle, exploration, or long-distance trade. This psychological orientation helps explain the extraordinary geographical reach and resilience of Viking activity. In conclusion, the Vikings' relationships with neighboring states and societies reveal them not as agents of indiscriminate destruction but as highly adaptable participants in a rapidly transforming medieval world. Their demographic strategies, family structures, and socio-psychological values formed the internal foundations that enabled them to engage with, influence, and ultimately integrate into the political and cultural systems of Europe and Eurasia. Viking history, viewed through this lens, is not a marginal or exotic episode but a central chapter in the shared history of the medieval world.